deeper understanding about donor-advised funds. Hi, I'm Bill Stanczykiewicz. This is the first day from the fundraising school, and I'm delighted to welcome back Dr. Danielle Vance McMullen, assistant professor at DePaul University in Chicago, and Dr. Dan Heist, an assistant professor at Brigham Young University. And longtime listeners of this podcast know that Danielle and Dan have combined their research curiosity into the Donor Advised Fund Research Collaborative, which in this first quarter of 2024 has come out with new data from an extensive research of many years of donor advised fund activity. And Danielle and Dan, thanks again for being with us on the Fundraising Schools podcast.
Thanks, Bill.
Thanks, Bill.
So Danielle, what is this study? Tell us, give us the context of this latest research from the Donor Advised Fund Research Collaborative.
You know, Bill, this is the largest ever research on donor advised funds. We've been lucky to team up with great researchers from around the country, both Dan and myself, as well as Jeff Williams and Brittany Kinker from Grand Valley State University. We have data on more than 50,000 accounts. We have collaborated with more than 110 donor advised fund sponsors to bring this data together. And we've collected many, many years of data, and all in the service of trying to get a better understanding of donor advised funds around the country.
This research has been ongoing for years, and now Danielle and Dan are taking a deeper dive. Donor advised funds have been around for decades. Took about 70 or 80 years to get to the first 1 million. Only 2 more years to get to the next million. Dan, this is quite a popular giving vehicle. Who is opening these donor advised funds?
Well, now that we have better data on donor advised funds all across the country, we're really seeing that donor advised funds are being used as kind of a mid-range philanthropic vehicle, right? So when we look at the size of accounts, when we look at the amount of money coming in, amount of money going out, what we're seeing is, this is a little bit more money than your checkbook, your credit card giving, but and it's the main amount of giving is not quite as much as normal private foundations. So it's kind of that mid-range of philanthropy. Now we do have lower level giving and higher level giving, and so donor advised funds can facilitate that full range of giving. But the bulk, the meat and potatoes of donor advised fund giving is really that kind of that mid-range philanthropic giving.
And in terms of the who, Dan, what does the study point to in terms of generationally? Are there certain generations using donor advised funds more than others?
For sure. Yeah, about half of the donors in our sample were baby boomer generations. We do see some of the older generations and some of the younger generations, but that's really kind of the main group of age group that we're seeing in donor advised funds.
And Danielle, what about the money going in? What does this research study point to in terms of the money going into the donor advised funds from these contributors?
Yeah, these donor advised funds often are getting money every few years. About 1 in 4 of our donor advised funds in this study had contributions in some years, 1 in 4 had contributions in most years, and 1 in 9 had contributions in every year. So what that means is that almost 2/3 of DAFs had multiple contributions during the time we were able to observe them. So we do see folks kind of using this more as a vehicle for money coming in as well as money going out. It's not necessarily as similar as a private foundation. We typically have one huge wealth event that opens a foundation and then it comes out over long, long periods of time. And what that means for our accounts is that about half of our accounts are less than $50,000. So going back to Dan's point about it being a mid-range vehicle, you kind of think about private foundations of being these tens of millions, 20s, $100 million vehicles. Donor advised funds are much more in that mid-range vehicle landscape, right? So half about less than 50,000, half more. We do see about 7% having balances of $1 million or more, but kind of in that mid-range, and those contributions support that kind of staying in that mid-range over a long period of time, even as people are making grants.
And we've talked before on this podcast, the concern that well-intended critics have is that since the donor receives any tax advantage right away, when the money goes into the donor advised fund, not when it comes out as a grant to a qualified 501c3, that it would be easy for folks to just use this as a tax shelter, get their tax write-off, and then just forget about the money. What does this study show in terms of how many folks are making contributions into their donor advised funds on an annual basis? Because I would just infer, it would seem to me that if I'm only using this for tax reasons, I'd be putting money into my DAF every single year just to avoid my taxes. What do these data show from this most recent report?
So in terms of money being placed into the DAF every year, we see about 1 in 9 had contributions every year. And those contributions are often in that 10,000 to 50,000 range. We have about 40% of our contributions in that range.
And 1 in 9 coming out to 11%, the data show in this most latest report. So it's not a huge preponderance. It's just this much smaller percentage. Dan, where's this money going when it comes out? And how often is it coming out?
Right. So on any given year, over 60% of DAFs will be making a grant out to another charity. And within a 3-year period, that's closer to 80%. So we do see money coming out regularly from donor advised funds. A few things that we were able to capture in this study that are of interest to our audience is that, you know, very few of these transactions, very few of these grants are actually anonymous. So that's been a big concern previously. What we found is less than 4% of the grant transactions that we tracked over 2.2 million grants over 9 years, and less than 4% of them were truly anonymous. What we're seeing is that most of the grants are unrestricted. So about 60% of the grants going out are unrestricted. Now, the restricted grants are a little bit bigger. So about 70% of the money coming out have some sort of restriction going to a scholarship fund or something like that. So there's a little bit of a mix of restricted and unrestricted. And so that helps us really understand kind of the nature of the types of grant making that's happening from DAFs.
One of the things I'd like to add to that is, those grants actually are coming out more evenly throughout the year than traditional typical philanthropy, right? So when we look at money going into DAFs, I think it's interesting to kind of compare it for this way. When we look at the money going into DAFs, a lot of that, almost 2/3 of that, is going into DAFs in the fourth quarter, people getting that in before the tax year ends. But when you look at money coming out of DAFs, that's much more evenly spread throughout the year. So actually only 32% of grant funding occurs in the fourth quarter. So if you're a major gift officer, if you're an annual fund officer for your organization, and you have folks that you know with DAFs, those folks, you should be asking them throughout the year, because they're no longer as tied to this calendar year idea of philanthropy when they have a DAF. And we actually see a nice bump in June when folks' fiscal years end and begin for DAF giving. And we see it really happening throughout the year, especially for gifts of that major gift level.
Danielle, I'm so glad you raised that point. I think that is just one sterling example of many in this report that gives us a deeper understanding of the behavior of donor advised fund donors, in that they are acting typically like a lot of donors, putting money in that fourth quarter. We know that about 40% of charitable giving in the United States happens in that final quarter, but now it still has to go out in grants, and that's happening throughout the year. And fundraising sometimes can be slower in the first quarter, sometimes can be slower in the second quarter. But now the behavior of donor advised funds donors, that's not the case. It can happen across the 12 months. Dan, I wanted to go back and ask you, in terms of the behaviors of the donor advised fund donors and the dollars that are going in. There's been this concern about what happens if the donor passes away, and the money is still there. This study has an important finding that provides some hope in that regard. What did you and Danielle find?
What we knew going into the study was that organizations would ask donors to set up a succession plan, which means that they would have some sort of plan in place for what happens to the money in the DAF when the original donors die. They could either name a successor advisor, a family member, a child or grandchild, to become the advisor on the account. They could leave the money to another charity through a grant, like a bequest. They could have the money transferred, stay within the DAF sponsoring organization, but just transferred over to a pooled account, like an area of interest fund, or just kind of the general endowment, if it was a community foundation or a Jewish federation. So we knew that those were possible. We just didn't know how many donor advised funds had those succession plans in place. So of the 57,000 accounts that we collected, almost all of them had a succession plan in place. 92% of accounts had a succession plan in place. Most of them, about 70% of them, were leaving the donor advised fund account to a successor advisor. So next gen, we're going to be advising the account, and then about 30% of them we're going to be transferring the money to another charity or into a pooled fund within the organization.
That is very encouraging data to show that donors are being very intentional, and it's consistent with your previous research, even research done by the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, that donor advised fund donors tend to be our more strategic donors. And that would certainly line up here that that strategy includes, when I'm no longer in this world, what's going to happen with this money? And I put a succession plan in place, as Dan just described. Danielle, if I could come back to you in this idea of, the money coming out and synthesizing with one of Dan's earlier replies. When we think about that, more than half of the grants out are unrestricted, but that the larger grants are restricted. When I read that, where my mind went was annual fund, major gift campaign. Am I right? Am I inferring correctly, Danielle, in seeing that the donor advised funds are being used in a similar way?
I think you're probably onto something there, Bill. I don't think we've really dug as deeply as we might into that statistic, but I do think you're onto something there, because our idea of what it means to be restricted in this data is really light, right? So if you even mentioned a specific program when you were making the grant, then we're considering it's probably a restricted gift. So we really started with the idea of pulling out the ones we knew for sure were unrestricted. They literally said were needed most. They just put nothing in the restrictions box. So I think a lot of the restrictions are could be very light restrictions. You might not even be, not necessarily we're leaving money to the basket weaving club or something like this. It could be very light restrictions. And I think a major gift campaign or capital campaign would fit a lot of what we would see in those kind of larger major gift.
And again, the data point, nearly 60% are unrestricted. That's important for fundraisers to know when they know they have a donor who has a donor advised fund. Dan, one more question for you. There's all this discussion about payout rate. And when there's conversations on Capitol Hill that, there should be a minimum payout rate similar to, what private foundations face with their 5% payout rate. What do the data show from this most recent study?
Yeah, what we're seeing is similar to what we've seen in the past, but we just have more data on this. Donor advised funds facilitate a really wide range of philanthropic behavior. And so we've got this group of donor advised funds that are giving more than half away a year. So they're really churning through the money pretty quickly. We've got kind of this middle group that will give maybe over 10% up to like 50%. And so, they're kind of using it every few years. And then we've got a group that act a little bit more like endowments or private foundations that are giving more in the 4 or 5% a year range. So donor advised funds, they facilitate all that behavior, right? So I think for the policy discussions, you have to consider the fact that this vehicle is very flexible and that donors are using it in a lot of different ways. We do see some evidence that there's about a fifth of the accounts were not giving within a 3-year period. We call those our inactive funds. And so I think those are something we need to pay attention to more in the future. And we've done a little bit of research on what those accounts look like.
And Danielle, if we look in the footnotes, there's an important point about that 22% not donating. What did you and Dan find?
Yeah, we decided to dig a little deeper this time into those inactive accounts. Really, those accounts tend to be smaller and newer than the active accounts. So if you're looking at those inactive accounts and you want to make some generalizations about them, they tend to be the smaller accounts, and they really tend to be the newer accounts. In fact, about 45% of those accounts were accounts that were opened quite recently within our data. So they were opened in the 2 or 3 years before we were collecting this data. And so for us, that means that really those donors may have not finished their ramp up process. And I talk about this a little bit because we have some findings looking at, how quickly donors grant out money after they open an account. We take a special look at opening contributions. And we find about half of our DAFs are granting at least half of their original contribution within 3 years. We find that about after 8 years, about 3/5 of them, maybe 60%, had granted out 100% of their original contribution. But overall in the data, when we look at kind of how people are spending those opening contributions, we see a ramp up period. So they kind of take a year or two to get moving and to start making those decisions. And so I think that's consistent with the fact that we see a greater proportion of new accounts in those inactive funds.
The national study on donor advised funds, and with all respect to our friends at Ohio State, it's the national study on donor advised funds. And I'll tell you, as our listeners and viewers can see here, Danielle and Dan have just significant expertise, research expertise, and being able to translate and analyze. I would recommend this study to everybody because what Dan and Danielle also have is a wonderful gift of making their data highly accessible. This report, while dense with data, you hear 9 years of data, tens of thousands of donor advised funds. It can feel overwhelming. This is a very accessible report written for all of us to be able to utilize in our fundraising planning, in our public policy discussions, and in our interaction with donors as we learn that they have donor advised funds. Again, the National Study on Donor Advised Funds from the Donor Advised Fund Research Collaborative. You look that up, you'll be able to find the study. It's available free of charge. And of course, donor advised funds are woven in throughout all of the 24 courses that we teach at the fundraising school that lead to 4 different certificates. And we can bring those courses, or we can take parts of courses and knit them together through our custom training. We have quarterly webinars and, of course, these weekly podcasts. We also have all of our teaching gathered in Achieving Excellence in Fundraising, the 5th edition. Guess who wrote the chapter on donor advised funds? Dan and Danielle. And all of it's available on our website at philanthropy.iupui.edu/the fundraising school. Grateful to Danielle Vance McMullen and Dan Heist for sharing their latest highly useful research on donor advised funds in a podcast produced by Mike Anthony and Jennifer Boffman. I'm Bill Stanczykiewicz, and now you are now more fully informed on this first day from the fundraising school.